and with great respect and honor, I introduce to you Brigadier General Tammy Smith.
Really a pleasure to be here, and we so much appreciate the invitation. And I traveled here today with my wife Tracey, so I'm going to give a critique afterwards. So I'm going to try and do my best here. And also point out, Jacksonville, we got you on the screen, so behave yourself out there. Just thank you again, NAVAIR, for the invitation to have the opportunity to speak today. And I'm honored to be invited, especially knowing that this is the first or the inaugural LGBT observance for NAVAIR. And I just so much, the room is full here. I see people on the outstations out there, and I'm just so thrilled to see members of the community and also allies who have come together to support diversity and inclusion. I of course, with my Army background, I have to give my one connection to the Navy, and that is that both of my parents joined the Navy, and they met at Norfolk in 1955 as young sailors there in the Navy. So that's my connection to the Navy, and I attribute a great deal of my service values and what I learned about being a member of the service to my parents and the example that they set for me. So a Pride celebration on a military installation, I mean, it's a fairly new thing, and I have to say to you here at NAVAIR, you are leading the way in what it means to create an inclusive culture. Because frankly, to fight and win our nation's war, we have to be able to tap into all of the talents of a diverse force. And I know it's easy to say, and maybe you got these questions as you were planning this event, is like, why do we need to celebrate Pride? Why do we need to know about anybody's personal life? And I have to say that Pride is not about anybody's personal life. I think that Pride is a celebration of authenticity. We celebrate Pride because the military is an organization that values its people. We celebrate Pride because we value being a meritocracy, where everyone who works hard, leads from the front, and lives their service values has equal opportunity to be successful and rewarded with increased responsibility. We celebrate Pride because we want to be an organization that attracts and retains the best all-volunteer force that's on the planet. And frankly, we're competing with corporate America for that talent. And so we have to demonstrate that we value inclusion and that we value talent from whatever demographic it comes to as people make the decision to join the ranks, whether in uniform or as a military civilian. And we celebrate Pride for all the same reasons we celebrate any other diversity group, because frankly we value our differences. And that's where some of our best ideas come from, is from that conversation about our differences. Pride celebrated in June of each year to connect with the anniversary of what were the Stonewall riots in 1969. Those were the riots in New York that were credited with launching what is the gay rights movement, the modern gay rights movement. And during a 3-day period following a police raid on a gay bar that was known as the Stonewall Inn, gays and lesbians finally said, they said enough. I will no longer be oppressed by you. I will no longer let you treat me as less than other Americans. I am exactly okay, exactly the way I am. So we celebrate Pride to acknowledge that no one has the right to tell others who they should be. No one has the right to tell others who they should not be. Pride is celebrated to push back against the marginalization that is common for LGBT people. The intent behind Pride in this setting is no different than the intent behind any diversity event. The organizers seek to educate, to inform, to defy stereotypes, and to help those in attendance more closely examine internally held bias that might inhibit an inclusive workplace. I've used the words diversity and inclusion. They're two different things. Diversity is the presence of difference. Inclusion is the recognition of that difference in a command climate in which everyone is comfortable enough to contribute, to speak up and put their best ideas at the table. Diversity is having a seat at the table. Inclusion is having a voice that can be heard at that table. You set the culture at your own tables here at NAVAIR. In my own personal journey, I've been limited by status quo thinking, and for the first 25 years of my career, I not only didn't have a full voice at that table, I'd be fired for speaking. My personal story, and I'd like to share that with you, is that I served under the ban on being open in the military for 25 years, and longer than that when you count my time as cadet in ROTC. I entered in 1982 into ROTC at the University of Oregon, and this is the point where I add Go Ducks. And when I entered in, I came into the military, I call it kind of accidentally. What do you do in a small town? You try to get out of your small town, right? Just like my parents went from a small town in Kentucky and that small town in Oregon, and they used the Navy as their way out of that small town. I thought that maybe an education is the way out of my small town. And I was reading my Future Farmers of America magazine. And they had this little flyer in it. It said, "No money for college? Let the Army show you how. Send for free information." And that free information was an ROTC scholarship application. So that was my way out of my small town, was through the education. And I thought, this Army thing, I can do that. I know my parents have served in the Navy. I can do that. So my means to the end, that education will get me out of my small town. So I entered in 1982. And what was going on in the Department of Defense in 1981 is that prior to 1981, there was no specific policy about people who were gay serving in the military. But in 1981, for the very first time, the Department of Defense did make a policy that specifically banned homosexuals from being in the military. So prior to that policy, now you might be dismissed from the military for what would be homosexual behavior. If somebody caught you in that sort of behavior, maybe kissing another person, that sort of thing. But there wasn't a specific policy that was about you as a person. And what is significant about this policy is that it actually said that just being that type of person was bad enough that you should not be in the ranks of our military, and if they found out that you would be dismissed. So I didn't know this. I'm just coming into college, wanting to get out of my small town. And I knew who I was when I entered the college. And about the time that this policy changed, we had a inclusion policy at the university. And the universities said, well, gee, Department of Defense, now that you've got this policy, you're kind of out of compliance here on our university campus. Your DOD policy is out of compliance with our university policy, and we're not sure that ROTC has a place on the university campus. And so what our professor of military science did is he asked one cadet from each of the classes to write a letter to the university saying about why ROTC should be allowed to stay on campus. And I was an ROTC contracted cadet with a scholarship, and they asked me to write one of those letters. And they kind of fed me what I was to write. They said, well, we don't ask cadets to declare, it's not like an enlistment contract, we don't ask them to declare whether or not they're gay or lesbian. And so technically, if we don't ask them, they're not violating the university policy, just so long as they don't tell. And so that's good. And I will tell you that I wrote that letter. And I was complicit in my own version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell as early as 1982. But think about how the world was in 1982. It was an economic choice in many cases. And we have found as LGBT people moving through, depending on your age, that sometimes you make that choice for yourself or your family, sometimes it is an economic choice. So I made that choice, and I wrote that letter and said that we should be able to stay on campus because of those reasons. And I went on to graduate and become a second lieutenant in the military. When I entered the military in a way that perhaps some of you who are a little older and who have had the same life experiences, is that I had entered the military and I had two sets of friends. I had my co-workers who I loved and I loved to hang out with, and we all worked hard, and my first assignment was in Panama, and they were great. And I loved hanging out with my friends who were my co-workers, and we did a lot of things together. But I had my second set of friends, and they were my off-the-grid friends. And those were the members of the gay and lesbian community. And there was a There were rules to how you interacted with your off-the-grid friends. First of all, there was no rank in the off-the-grid friends, because really, when you compare fraternization to getting kicked out for being gay or lesbian, fraternization seemed like a minor foul in this. And you also had you knew how to interact with each other. So you knew that if you happened on to one of your off-the-grid friends in the motor pool, or if you saw them in the commissary or the PX, you knew that you had to walk by each other and pretend like you did not know each other. Because doing anything else would call into question, well, but how do you know Sergeant Jones? Sergeant Jones isn't in your unit. And so you just knew with your off-the-grid friends that you had to completely compartmentalize your life in order for no one to discover this other half of what your life was. You kept that completely secret in this compartment. And the people who also lived in that compartment with you, they understood the rules. Not so different perhaps as we talk about the time period of what school teachers have done and what many other professions have had to do. But this was the case, and this was my experience here in a military setting. So I learned to live this compartmentalized life. I got pretty good at it. I kept my off-the-grid friends. I was able to avoid, as far as I know, any investigation, though there were witch hunts that went on, because remember, it's just the being that person that was enough to get you dismissed from the military. It didn't have to do with any behavior. Just being that type of person was enough to get you dismissed. So we moved forward in 1993, and some things changed in the conversation. And that's when we got the law that became the policy known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And that was a conversation that became a compromise, and that was essentially what the law said, and the policy that became part of it, is that we won't ask you, meaning that they removed that question from enlistment contacts, and as long as you don't tell us, then everything is good. It's okay to be who you are, but we don't want to know who you are. And the thing, as I look back in 1993, at that time I celebrated this. This was progress. So long as I didn't tell anybody who I was, and as long as nobody really knew me, it was okay to be who I was. And somehow that felt like progress. As I look back on that, I realized that at that time I was simply celebrating my own self-marginalization in the form of this new policy. But at the time, in 1993, it really did feel like progress. And I always think of it also in the terms of what I think about is the paradox of compromise. Is that when you are writing your policies and you come to a compromise, at the end of the day, someone got compromised. And we must always remember that as we work through what our policy compromise, and to always try and remember that there are humans on the receiving end of all of those decisions and all of those compromises, and that we acknowledge the human side of that compromise. But here's the deal about the compromise we accepted at that time, is that there is something about wearing the uniform of your nation. There is something about the pride that you feel when you put on this uniform, and you know that when you put on this uniform, that you are representing externally the values of our nation. You're representing the values of your particular service. Some places in the world we know that the only symbol that some people have of what is America is a uniform of someone perhaps in an outpost, someplace in Afghanistan or Iraq, and many places that we are in the world. And we were willing to compromise ourselves because we felt so strongly about what it meant to serve and to represent the values to us that were higher, the values of America and the values of this uniform. So as I moved forward, my life was pretty good. I was representing the values. I had become an expert at this compartmentalized life. And then something happened to me in 2004 that kind of knocked me off my rails a little bit. What happened in 2004 that changed everything for me is that I met Tracey. And I have to tell you that it's pretty easy to live the compartmentalized life until you fall in love. And now all of a sudden, the thing that mattered most to me in the world was the very thing that I couldn't share with where I spent the majority of my life and my work life. Because we know that when you are committed to the military life, that I mean, it's more than just 8 hours a day. And the most important thing in my life I couldn't share. And for me personally, it became harder and harder to be in uniform, because it became harder and harder to have these compartments separate and to hide who Tracey was, and to know that when we were in the grocery store in our neighborhood, if she heard, "Hey ma'am, good to see you," she knew to just peel off, just as my friends in the motor pool had done 15 years earlier. She knew to do that. And so it got harder. So the world was changing. Many states were recognizing marriage. As we moved forward, there was a conversation going on about whether or not Don't Ask, Don't Tell should be repealed. And as these conversations were going on, and as I was going through this period myself, frankly, it became too hard to serve. And what I decided to do was that I couldn't serve anymore. And what I wanted to do was, I wanted my voice to be heard, and I decided that the best thing for me personally was to retire. And so I requested retirement, and I was approved. And Tracey can tell you that my heart was heavy. Because I loved being in uniform, but I just couldn't do it. I had this internal dissonance of what were my personal values and the institutional values, and I just didn't do it anymore. I got those retirement orders. Then in February 2010, Chairman Mullen, who was asked to come and testify to the Senate about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he said those amazing words, and I wrote them down to make sure that I got them exactly right. He says, "We have in place a policy that forces young men and women to lie about who they are in order to defend their fellow citizens." And he said, "For me personally, it comes down to integrity. Theirs as an individual, ours as an institution." And I heard those words, and I gotta tell you, I cried. Because for the first time in my entire military career, at this point it had been about 23 years, it was the first time that somebody in uniform said that my service was as valuable as anybody else's service. That I, as a person, was as honorable as anybody else who served in uniform. And in that, he also gave me hope. He gave me hope that maybe this policy would change. And so with that hope, Tracey and I talked about it, and I said, well, maybe I shouldn't retire. Maybe there is hope that this policy would change. So I went back to my chain of command, and I said, I've been thinking about this, and I've decided that maybe it's not a good time, maybe I was premature in requesting my retirement, maybe I could take it back. And they were supportive of that, and they said, well, we don't understand, you're a good soldier, we thought it was kind of stupid you were retiring anyway. But really, what could I have told them? I couldn't tell them the truth, but they allowed me to take back that retirement. And because of that, I was still in the ranks when I was then eligible and was selected for promotion to general officer. And the thing about Admiral Mullen is that he continued to play a role, because soon after that pulling back the retirement, as I was in Afghanistan. And while I was in Afghanistan, Tracey went ahead and carried on some of the traditions that we normally did living in Arlington, Virginia area. And she went to the Arlington National Cemetery on Memorial Day, just as we normally did together. And we like to go to Section 16 and interact with the families, because that is where the casualties of the current conflicts are buried, is in that one section of the cemetery. And what happens is, because so many of these casualties, so many of these sacrifices have been so recent, quite often when you go there, you will have the opportunity to interact with the families, especially on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. So she was there on Memorial Day while I was in Afghanistan. And as she was there, she saw walking through the area and also interacting with the families, she saw this white uniform going through. And she realized that it was Admiral Mullen. And she went up to him, and she had the opportunity to thank him for those words, and to tell him, to express to him how much those words had meant to me, and that even though Don't Ask, Don't Tell was still in place, that I was over in Afghanistan, but I felt hope, that he had given me hope as a senior leader. And so she had the opportunity to say that to him. So just think about what Tracey did. Tracey outed me to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Oh, goodness. But I got to tell you what Chairman Mullen did. He said to her, whenever I run across a military family member and I find out that their service member is deployed, he goes, if I'm able to, I try and catch up with the service member when I make a trip in country, and if I'm able to do that, I'll catch up with your service member. And sure enough, I got a call there in Bagram, Afghanistan, from the protocol office of U.S. Forces Afghanistan, saying the chairman's office is trying to locate you and confirm your location because the chairman would like to see you. And of course, my first thought is, I wonder what Tracey's done. But you know, true to his word, he came and found me there in Afghanistan, and I had a few minutes with him in the dining facility there in Bagram. I was waiting for him. I got to observe him come in, and he's with his people that bring him around, and he's with about 15 members of the international press, and he's having a press conference there and a discussion with them, and he's answering very hard-hitting questions about the security situation there, what's going on with Pakistan, many things that are going on with the Army budget or the military budget, things such as that. And then he comes to me, and he just then has this very human interaction with me to ask me about how things are going, what I'm doing there on my tour, and treating us just as any other family member. And then I see him get whisked away by his security detail. He gets loaded up in that up-armored Suburban that many of you are familiar with from your tours around the world, and they whisk him away. And you know, he has the wherewithal that he gets on his BlackBerry, and he sends Tracey an email. And he goes, "Slayer Soldier, it's good. It's all good." And what a lesson for me in what it means not only to recognize a family, but what it means for our military leaders and how we should interact with our families. Because whoever your family is, that's your family. And what a great demonstration for me as a military leader about how leaders should interact with their military families. So soon after that, after my redeployment from Afghanistan, it was not long after that well, first of all, I was in Afghanistan when No NAS Hotel was finally repealed, and that was in September of 2011. And I remember that I woke up that morning, and I knew that on that day that everything was different. And I walked down Disney Drive, and on the way to the same dining facility that I had met the chairman in, and I thought, today's different. And I was looking, I was going to catch somebody's eye, because I knew that there was going to be some other people out there having a day just like me. And as I looked around, I got nothing. You know, and it was just another day in Afghanistan. And in so many ways, that was absolutely perfect, because everything had changed for me, but nothing had really changed for the military, because dedicated service members were still out there doing their job, doing the things that were necessary in Afghanistan. And so repeal happened exactly as it should have. Soon after I got back, in May of 2011, I was notified about the promotion. And Tracey and I had to make a decision about what we were going to do, because we knew of the heightened visibility of being a flag officer and what that would mean. And so what we decided together that during the promotion that she would participate, and that she would be exactly who she was, that we would not pretend that she was anything other than my spouse during that promotion ceremony. And so just with the timing of the intersection of the timing of repeal and when our promotion was, in that instance when she put that star on my shoulder, she outed me again as this time then as the first openly gay flag officer in the military. And I got to tell you, I was afraid. I've had to relearn 25 years of being compartmentalized. I've had to relearn and fight through, in a sense, the internalized homophobia that exists from all of these years, 25 years of messaging from the same institution that says who you are isn't quite good enough, that you are not honorable, that if we find you, that we will dismiss you. And so I've had to go through, from what perhaps many service members have had to go through, is working through what it means now to serve openly, to serve authentically. And I tell you, think about family support. I couldn't do that without the support that I have had from Tracey. And I have to say, when we think about this bigger picture and we wrap up what is my personal story into what does it mean then to be inclusion, to have inclusion, what does inclusion mean, is that your inclusion cannot be neutral. Is that there has to be a demonstration that you are an inclusive organization, an inclusive person. Just seeing you here today is a demonstration that at NAVAIR we value all of our service members, that we value all of our employees. Just your demonstration, just by showing up, you have signaled, you've done more than be neutral. you have signaled to the workforce that inclusion matters, and especially on this particular day that LGBT inclusion matters. And so for Pride Month, after all the years that I served with no voice at the table, I celebrate now. It's my own right to live without fear of discharge, for simply being the human I was born to be. Without fear of sexual harassment or assault by people who could get away with it in the past by threatening to out me to the chain of command. I now celebrate my right to live without fear for a lack of medical care for my family, who are Tracey's now covered in years. Live without fear that I can't maintain the same financial stability as my straight bears serving in uniform. Without fear that Tracey could be legally forbidden by others from standing by the transfer case that might return my remains from a combat zone. My life has come really full circle from when I wrote that letter in ROTC. And in less than 4 years, Tracey has gone from being essentially illegal to now being able to be here with me today. And so for the first time in my career too, one of the decisions we made after she was able to get her ID card is that we decided that we would move on to post. And we live on Fort Belvoir for the very first time, our first time to have the ability to live in military housing. And so you have to wonder, how were we received? Well, our neighbors, they knocked on the door and they brought us cookies to welcome us. So we live the same ordinary, everyday life as any other military family. So having my family recognized in this way, that keeps me horribly strong. So I appreciate your attention today and for what you are doing here in NAVAIR for inclusion for everyone. And I appreciate so much the opportunity to share my story with you. So thank you very much.